The December air hung heavy over Los Angeles, carrying with it that strange stillness that often precedes a farewell. From the outside, Forrester Creations glittered with its usual perfection, glass panels reflecting light like shards of a dream that refused to fade, but inside, Thomas Forrester was drowning in silence. His world had become a gallery of ghosts. Sketches once drawn with passion now mocked him with emptiness. Fabrics that had once meant possibility now suffocated him with memory. Every inch of that studio whispered her name. Hope. He had tried to let go, to reason with his heart, to convince himself that what he felt was misguided, temporary, even unhealthy. But how do you convince a drowning man that air is enough when he's tasted the sea? He had returned to Los Angeles expecting nothing and everything all at once. After months abroad trying to rebuild his focus, he'd walked into Forrester Creations believing he was stronger, more disciplined, more self-aware. He had learned to breathe again without her shadow. But all of that collapsed the moment he saw her at the design table beside Liam, laughter dancing between them like sunlight through glass. It wasn't cruel, not intentional, just the kind of effortless closeness that used to be his. The sight had been enough to unravel him completely. Every hope he'd rebuilt turned to dust in that instant. It wasn't jealousy that consumed him. Not really. It was the realization that the story he had written in his mind had reached its final page, and hope had closed the book long before he did. For weeks after that, Thomas wandered through his father's company as though it were a museum of the life he no longer belonged to. He tried to bury himself in work, but every seam, every silhouette, every shade of fabric seemed to echo her smile, her forgiveness, her faith in him when no one else had believed he could change. But now she belonged to another life, one that didn't include him. Liam had won. Or perhaps, Thomas realized bitterly, it had never been a competition to begin with. Hope had simply chosen the life that felt safer, steadier, and he couldn't fault her for that. He had been the storm, and Liam, for all his flaws, was the calm after it. At first, he told himself he would endure. He would stay for Douglas, focus on being a father, ignore the way his chest tightened every time Hope entered the room. But even that small comfort began to unravel. Douglas, ever perceptive, had begun asking questions. Why his father looked sad when Hope was near, why he stayed up late sketching dresses that looked like fairy tale versions of her. Thomas had no answers, only a growing fear that his pain would one day spill into his son's innocence. He wanted to be better, but how could he teach peace when his own soul was a battlefield? And so, in the quiet hours of one sleepless night, he made his decision. He would leave Los Angeles. Not in anger, not in defeat, but in surrender. The decision felt both heavy and liberating. He imagined what life might look like somewhere else, a small coastal town where no one knew his name, where he could rebuild quietly, design under anonymity, perhaps even rediscover art without the chaos of family and heartbreak. For the first time in years, he didn't think of success or a legacy. He thought of peace. He thought of Douglas running barefoot on some quiet beach, free from the shadows of Forrester drama, from whispered rumors, from the weight of being a child born into a dynasty that demanded too much from everyone it touched. He spent days preparing in secret, telling no one but Douglas. It was the hardest conversation of his life. Sitting beside his son in the dim light of their living room, Thomas spoke softly, careful not to let his voice tremble. He told Douglas they were going on an adventure, a new chapter, just the two of them. Douglas had blinked at him, wide-eyed, torn between excitement and uncertainty. "Will Mommy come?" the boy had asked innocently, and the question pierced through Thomas like a blade. He smiled, though it felt like breaking. "No, buddy. This is just us. But you'll see her again one day. I promise." He hugged his son tightly then, breathing in the smell of innocence, the scent of something he wanted desperately to protect. After Douglas had gone to bed, Thomas began to write the letters. There were 3, one for Ridge, one for Steffi, and one for Hope. Each was written on thick, cream stationery, the kind his father favored, and sealed with the simplicity of finality. For Ridge, he wrote with both love and disappointment, thanking his father for always believing in his talent, but gently accusing him of never truly understanding his heart. "You taught me how to build," he wrote, "but not how to rest. You taught me to fight for what I wanted, but not when to stop." For Steffi, his words were softer. She had always been his anchor, his fiercest protector, and he told her that she had nothing left to fix. "You've saved me enough times," he wrote. "It's time I learn how to save myself." But the letter to Hope that one took the longest. He stared at the blank page for hours, the words refusing to come. What could he possibly say that she hadn't already heard in his silence? In the end, he wrote not of love, but of release. "You gave me something I didn't think I deserved, forgiveness. You believed in a version of me that I wanted to become, and for that, I will always be grateful. Don't feel guilty for choosing peace. I'm finally choosing it too." He didn't mention the pain or the sleepless nights. He didn't ask for her to come after him. He simply folded the letter, sealed it, and placed it in an envelope addressed to her, hoping it would reach her heart but not haunt it. He left Los Angeles at dawn. The city was still asleep, its skyline bathed in the pale blue of early morning. Douglas sat in the back seat of the car, his small suitcase beside him, clutching the toy airplane Thomas had given him years ago. The roads were empty, the world quiet, as if granting them one final mercy. Thomas glanced in the rearview mirror at the faint outline of Forrester Creations disappearing in the distance, the building shrinking with every turn. It didn't feel like escape. It felt like exhale. Hours later, when the sun was higher, the letters were found. Charlie had brought them up from the delivery desk, assuming they were some kind of personal correspondence. Ridge was the first to read his. At first, he thought it was a prank, his son, emotional as always, threatening to disappear to prove a point. But as his eyes moved over the neat, careful handwriting, his expression changed. The reality hit him with the weight of years of misunderstanding. He had pushed Thomas too hard, demanded too much, refused to see how fragile he truly was beneath the bravado. By the time Steffi entered the office, Ridge's voice was raw. "He's gone," he said simply, holding the letter out to her. Steffi's reaction was immediate: panic, disbelief, anger. She read the letter once, then twice, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less final. Her first instinct was to call Hope. She needed to know if Thomas had spoken to her, if she'd somehow convinced him to stay. When Hope picked up the phone, her voice was light, distracted. She was at her wedding rehearsal, surrounded by laughter and flowers. But when Steffi told her about the letter, the noise around her seemed to fade. Her hand tightened around the phone, her heart pounding. She barely heard Steffi's voice on the other end, the words blurring into static. Hope found the letter waiting for her in her office later that afternoon, lying on her desk like a quiet ghost. The envelope was simple, unmarked except for her name and Thomas's precise handwriting. She hesitated before opening it, as if doing so might make it too real. The words inside hit her like a whisper and a scream all at once. She read it once, then again, tears filling her eyes before she could stop them. The wedding planner called her name from down the hall, asking about the floral arrangements, but Hope couldn't move. The world outside her office continued. Music, chatter, the rhythm of a day preparing for celebration, but inside, everything had gone still. That night, on the eve of her wedding to Liam, Hope sat by the window, staring out at the city lights. The letter rested in her lap, its edges creased from her grip. She told herself she was happy, that she was marrying the man she loved, the father of her child, the one who had stood by her through every storm. And yet, in the quiet corners of her heart, there was a hollow space where Thomas's name still lingered. Not as a lover, not as a mistake, but as a soul she had failed to save. She thought of all the times she had looked into his eyes and seen the storm inside him, the longing to be better, to be loved, to belong. She had believed that love could heal him, but she had also learned that love, no matter how pure, couldn't fix what someone had to face alone. When morning came, Hope walked down the aisle with a smile that almost reached her eyes. Liam waited for her, steady and sure, unaware of the letter folded inside her bouquet, tucked between the roses, a secret reminder of the man who had once loved her with all the wrong intensity and all the right heart. As the ceremony began, she felt both gratitude and grief. Gratitude for the life she was stepping into, grief for the one that had quietly slipped away. Somewhere far from Los Angeles, Thomas watched the ocean crash against the shore, Douglas laughing beside him as he built a sandcastle. The horizon stretched endlessly before them, the kind of horizon that promised beginnings instead of endings. For the first time in years, Thomas felt light. He missed his family, his home, the chaos of the life he'd left behind, but he didn't regret it. He had made the right choice for himself, for Douglas, and perhaps, in some small way, for Hope too. Because love wasn't always about holding on. Sometimes it was about knowing when to let go and finding peace in the space that remained. And in Los Angeles, as the sun dipped below the skyline, Hope looked toward that same horizon and whispered a silent prayer, not for reunion, not for forgiveness, but for Thomas to finally find the calm he had spent his whole life chasing. In that shared silence between them, though miles apart, something shifted. Not an ending, but the quiet grace of two souls learning, at last, how to let each other go. The morning began like any other in Los Angeles, a fragile, deceptive calm that seemed to hover over the city as if it were holding its breath. The sky was pale gold, the air washed clean by a night of light rain, and Forrester Creations gleamed under the rising sun like a monument to everything the Forrester family had built, their legacy, their ambition, their pride. None of them knew that by sunset, all of it would feel meaningless. On the far side of town, at a quiet private airfield surrounded by the hum of idling engines and the faint cry of gulls, Thomas Forrester stood beside a small private jet, his hand resting protectively on Douglas's shoulder. To the world, it was a simple departure, a father and son beginning anew, leaving behind the ghosts of a city that had broken them. But beneath the surface, it was something far deeper, a desperate attempt to outrun a pain that had no map and no end. Thomas had always believed in creation as redemption. When life spun out of control, he designed. When his heart broke, he drew. When guilt consumed him, he built beauty from chaos. But this time, the sketchbook was empty. The months of struggle, the humiliations, the whispers about his obsession with Hope, the pitying looks from Ridge and Steffi, all of it had hollowed him out. He had tried to move on, to rebuild, to make peace with losing her. He had tried to be a father Douglas could look up to instead of pity. Yet as each day passed, he felt the city closing in on him, its noise suffocating, its light too harsh, its memories too heavy. Leaving wasn't a decision. It was an instinct for survival. Douglas had sensed something was different that morning. His father's tone was softer, almost peaceful, like someone who had finally stopped fighting the tide. Thomas had packed light, just a suitcase each, their passports, a few sketches rolled into tubes, and Douglas's favorite toy airplane. The plan was simple: fly to the East Coast, rent a small house by the sea, start over. A place with no paparazzi, no board meetings, no whispers of scandal, just waves, sand, and the sound of a child's laughter. "It's a new adventure," Thomas had said with a faint smile as they boarded, and Douglas, ever trusting, believed him. The engines roared to life, cutting through the crisp morning air, and within minutes, the small jet lifted off the runway, gliding effortlessly above the Pacific horizon. From the ground, it was a silver thread against the sky, bright and fleeting. Inside, Thomas felt a flicker of something that almost resembled relief. He looked at his son, whose face was pressed to the window, eyes wide with wonder. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" he asked softly. Douglas nodded, grinning, unaware of the turbulence waiting not just in the clouds, but in fate itself. The first sign of trouble came 30 minutes after takeoff. A shudder ran through the cabin, subtle but unmistakable. The pilot, an experienced man named Carter who had flown for the Forresters before, frowned as alarms flickered on the control panel. Thomas, sensing the tension, leaned forward. "Everything okay?" Carter forced a reassuring smile, the kind that professionals wear when reassurance is all they have left. "Just a small system glitch," he said. But his eyes told another story. He began adjusting knobs, radioing the tower, his calm voice masking urgency. Then came the second jolt, stronger this time, enough to make Douglas grab his father's arm. The aircraft lurched slightly to one side, the sound of the engines deepening into a growl. Thomas's heart began to race. "It's fine, buddy," he said, tightening his grip on his son's hand. "We're just hitting a few bumps." But he knew enough about planes to recognize the tremor of fear behind the pilot's movements. Outside, the sky darkened unexpectedly, a smear of clouds swallowing the sunlight. The cabin lights flickered. A smell, faint, acrid, filled the air. Within moments, chaos erupted. Warning sirens screamed from the cockpit, the cabin shaking violently as Carter struggled to regain control. "We're losing hydraulics," he shouted, voice breaking through the static of the radio. Thomas could barely process the words before the cabin tilted sharply downward, throwing him forward. Douglas cried out, his small hands gripping the seatbelt. "Dad!" The world became noise and motion, alarms, wind, prayers muttered under breath. Thomas wrapped his arms around his son, pulling him close, his voice steady even as the plane trembled beneath them. I've got you, don't let go." The pilot fought desperately to level the aircraft, his knuckles white against the controls. For a moment, it seemed like he might succeed, the nose lifting, the shaking subsiding. But then came a blinding flash from the left wing. A mechanical scream ripped through the sky, and in an instant, the world exploded into light. The jet vanished into fire, a bloom of smoke and flame tearing through the clouds before falling toward the sea. By the time emergency responders reached the coordinates, there was nothing left but debris, fragments of twisted metal scattered across miles of ocean. The news broke within hours. "Private jet linked to Forrester family explodes mid-flight," the headlines read, accompanied by a photograph of Thomas and Douglas from a charity gala just weeks before. Forrester Creations, the empire built on beauty and perfection, was now draped in grief. Rich Forrester was in his office when the call came. He had been reviewing fabric samples, irritated that nothing looked quite right, when his phone buzzed. He almost didn't answer, assuming it was another supplier. But the moment he heard the voice on the other end, trembling, hesitant, official, the world stopped. Words like accident, explosion, and confirmed passenger list blurred together, their meaning incomprehensible until he heard his son's name. Thomas Forrester. And then another, smaller, softer name. Douglas Forrester. The phone slipped from his hand. For a moment, there was nothing, no sound, no air, just a vacuum where his heart had been. His legs gave out, and he sank into the chair, staring at the floor as if it might offer some escape from what he'd just heard. His assistant entered, startled by the sound of the phone clattering to the ground, but Ridge couldn't speak. When Brooke rushed in minutes later, she found him pale and shaking, his eyes glassy. "What happened?" she asked, fear rising in her voice. Ridge looked at her, the words breaking out in a hoarse whisper. "They're gone." Brooke froze. "Who?" she whispered, though part of her already knew. The silence that followed was its own answer. When the truth hit, she stumbled backward, her hand covering her mouth as tears blurred her vision. "No," she breathed. "No, that can't be. There has to be a mistake." Ridge couldn't move, couldn't think. The phone lay between them like an open wound, the call still connected, the distant voice on the other end asking if he was still there. At the cliffside home overlooking Malibu, Steffi Forrester received the news from Finn. He had been the one to see it on the hospital television first, the breaking headline scrolling across the screen, and his first instinct had been to turn it off, to shield her from it. But Steffi, sensing the shift in his energy, had already taken the remote from his hand. Her breath caught as she read the names, her mind rejecting what her eyes confirmed. "No," she said, shaking her head violently. "That's wrong. It's wrong. He called me this morning. Her voice cracked. He said he was taking Douglas on a trip. He didn't say goodbye. Finn tried to hold her, but she pushed him away, collapsing to the floor as sobs tore through her body. The sound was raw, primal, the kind of grief that shakes the walls. "He can't be gone," she cried. "Not Thomas. Not Douglas." Finn knelt beside her, his own tears silent but steady, knowing there were no words that could reach her through the storm. By evening, the Forrester mansion was a mausoleum of disbelief. Reporters gathered outside the gates, their cameras flashing through the iron bars as if grief were something that could be photographed. Inside, Ridge sat in the study surrounded by family, Brooke, Steffi, Taylor, Eric, each of them shattered in different ways. The fireplace crackled softly, indifferent to the agony that filled the room. Taylor was the last to arrive. She had been in another city when the news reached her, and the flight back had been a blur of panic and denial. When she walked through the door, her eyes found Ridge's, and the truth passed between them without a word. She crossed the room in silence, falling into his arms, both of them shaking. "He was supposed to be okay," she whispered, her voice breaking. "He promised he was okay." Ridge buried his face in her shoulder, his sobs muffled. "I should have stopped him," he choked out. "He said he needed space, and I let him go. I let him take my grandson." In another part of town, Hope Logan sat at her dressing table, still in her wedding gown. The ceremony had been postponed, not because of nerves or logistics, but because the news had reached her minutes before she walked down the aisle. Liam had found her in the bridal suite, clutching her phone, her face drained of all color. The letter Thomas had written to her days earlier lay open on the table beside her bouquet, its edges crumpled, the ink smudged by tears. She had read it over and over since his departure, wondering if it was truly goodbye or just a plea for understanding. Now she knew it was both. Hope's reflection stared back at her, a ghost in white lace. Her thoughts were a whirl of guilt and disbelief. She remembered the last conversation she'd had with him, how she'd told him she wanted peace, how he'd smiled sadly and said he hoped she found it. She hadn't realized then that he meant forever. He didn't have to leave, she whispered to herself. He didn't have to die. Liam stood behind her, unsure what to say, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "You couldn't have known," he murmured. But Hope didn't hear him. Her heart was somewhere over the ocean, burning with the wreckage of what could never be repaired. Forrester Creations closed its doors the next day. The flagship building was draped in black silk, the company's iconic logo covered in mourning cloth. Messages of condolences poured in from around the world, designers, celebrities, industry giants, all paying tribute to Thomas Forrester, the prodigy who had turned pain into art, and to Douglas, the child who had represented hope for a family built on tragedy. Eric, too frail to attend the public memorial, sat in his study surrounded by photographs. Thomas as a boy, Thomas at his first fashion show, Thomas holding Douglas in his arms. "It should have been me," he whispered into the emptiness. "Not them." In the weeks that followed, grief transformed the family in quiet, devastating ways. Ridge withdrew completely, haunted by what he saw as his failure as a father. Brooke tried to hold him together, though she too was unraveling under the weight of memories. Steffi, once fierce and composed, became fragile, visiting the cliff where she and Thomas had shared countless childhood moments, speaking to the wind as if her brother might somehow hear her. And Hope visited the memorial every morning before dawn, laying a single white rose beside the stone engraved with Thomas's name. She never said much, only whispered, "I'm sorry." Yet amid the sorrow, rumors began to stir. Pieces of the wreckage were recovered miles from the reported crash site, leading some to speculate that not everything about the explosion was as it seemed. The black box, damaged but partially readable, contained fragments of a conversation. Thomas's voice, calm, telling Douglas to hold tight. The pilot's voice, frantic, reporting interference on the radio. "It's not mechanical," Carter had said moments before the recording cut off. "It's deliberate." The revelation reignited something in Ridge, a spark of purpose buried under grief. If there had been foul play, if someone had caused the explosion, then his son and grandson's deaths were not fate, but murder. And Rich Forrester, broken as he was, vowed quietly that he would not rest until he knew the truth. But for now, Los Angeles mourned. The city that had given Thomas everything, success, love, redemption, now carried his absence like a scar. The Forrester mansion stood silent under gray skies, its windows reflecting the fading light of a family that had once seemed untouchable. And somewhere beyond the clouds, where the wreckage of that small jet had fallen, the sea kept its secrets, carrying with it the echoes of a father's promise and a son's laughter, a reminder that even in a world built on beauty, nothing was ever truly safe from tragedy. The winter sun crept slowly over the Los Angeles skyline, painting Forrester Creations in a muted glow that seemed almost deceptive in its calm. Beneath that polished perfection of glass and steel, emotions simmered, guilt, ambition, love, and betrayal all colliding in the corridors of the fashion empire. Monday, December 1st, 2025, was supposed to be a return to normalcy after the long Thanksgiving weekend, a day when sketches and fabrics once again commanded the energy of the room. But nothing about this day would be ordinary. The ghosts of Luna Nozawa's death lingered too heavily in the air, and the confession Dylan carried inside her chest was about to shatter the fragile illusion of peace that the Forresters and Spencers tried so desperately to maintain. Dylan stood in front of the Forrester building, her hands trembling, the weight of her secret pressing against her ribs. The world seemed to move in fragments, the sound of passing cars, the faint murmur of employees returning from lunch, the flutter of leaves caught in the wind. Everything felt unreal, as if she were trapped between confession and collapse. Luna's name had haunted her dreams for nights, without end. The accident replayed in her mind with merciless precision, the flash of headlights, the sound of metal against flesh, the silence that followed. She could still see Luna's eyes in that final moment, wide with shock rather than pain, and that image had burrowed itself into her soul. She had told herself it was an accident, that Luna had appeared out of nowhere, that there was nothing she could have done. But the more she tried to believe it, the more the guilt consumed her. When she entered the main design office, she saw Steffi and Finn standing near the drafting table, their conversation soft, their grief still palpable. They were a couple bound not only by love, but by loss, the kind of loss that eroded certainty. Luna's death had left an invisible fracture between them, a shared sorrow that neither could heal. Finn had buried himself in work, in medicine, in any distraction that allowed him to avoid the hollow echo of his daughter's name. Steffi, ever the strong one, had tried to carry them both, but there were cracks in her composure too, subtle but deep. The moment Dylan stepped in, both of them turned, their expressions shifting from surprise to something unspoken, pity, maybe, or a recognition of pain they understood too well. Finn, Steffi, Dylan's voice trembled, and before she could finish, tears blurred her vision. The words spilled out, jagged and uneven, carrying the weight of weeks of silence. "It was me," she whispered. "I was the one who hit Luna." The confession seemed to hang in the air like a fragile thread, connecting all three of them through shock and sorrow. For a long moment, no one spoke. Finn's eyes widened, disbelief first, then devastation. His hands clenched at his sides, every instinct in him torn between rage and compassion. Steffi took a step forward, her voice soft but steady. "Dylan," she said gently, "what happened?" The story poured out of her, the panic, the fear, the blinding headlights, the way Luna had appeared out of nowhere. She swore she hadn't seen her until it was too late. It had been raining, the road slick, her mind scattered after the confrontation at the studio. Luna had been desperate that night, unhinged, lashing out at everyone she believed had betrayed her. Dylan had just wanted to help, to calm her down, but when Luna ran, instinct took over. She followed, worried the girl might hurt herself, and then it happened. The impact, the scream that wasn't quite a scream, and then the silence. Finn felt the room tilt beneath him. The daughter he had just begun to mourn now felt closer, and farther away all at once. He could see Dylan shaking, her guilt consuming her like fire, but he also saw something else: sincerity. She wasn't lying to protect herself. She was breaking because she couldn't live with the truth. For a long moment, he said nothing, the doctor in him wrestling with the father. He wanted to hate her, to scream, to make her feel the pain he had felt since that night. But the healer in him saw the trembling hands, the eyes swollen from sleepless nights, the fragility of a woman who could barely stand under the weight of her conscience. Steffi reached for Dylan's hand, her voice trembling but kind. "You didn't mean to hurt her. We know that." But even as she said it, part of her heart rebelled. Luna's death had shattered more than one family, and forgiveness felt like a word too soft for the gravity of it all. Yet she knew what hatred could do. She had seen it consume the Forresters, the Spencers, the Logans time and again. This time, she wanted to stop the cycle before it began. Meanwhile, across town at Spencer Publications, Bill Spencer sat behind his mahogany desk, his eyes fixed on the skyline that had once symbolized everything he had conquered. But even empires grew lonely. His latest plan wasn't about business. It was about reclaiming something personal. Katie Logan, the woman he had lost and never stopped wanting, still occupied too much space in his thoughts. Watching her flourish at Forrester Creations had been bittersweet. He admired her strength, but hated that it wasn't by his side. And so, in typical Bill Spencer fashion, he had devised a strategy. He would bring her back into his world, not with roses or promises, but with opportunity. He called her that afternoon, his tone confident but warm. Katie had learned long ago to recognize that particular tone, the one that meant Bill was about to mix business with emotion. When she arrived at his office, he greeted her with that familiar smile, one that disarmed even the sharpest of her instincts. "Katie," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him, "I have an offer I think you'll want to hear." Katie listened, her expression unreadable as Bill laid out his plan. He wanted her to leave Forrester Creations and return to Spencer Publications, not as an assistant or an executive in name only, but as an equal partner. He wanted her voice, her vision, her integrity. "You've always been the balance I needed," he admitted. "And I think Will deserves to see his parents building something together again." The proposal was tempting, not just professionally, but emotionally. Katie had always loved the challenge of shaping something meaningful, and Bill knew how to appeal to that side of her. But she also knew better than to confuse partnership with reconciliation. "Bill," she said softly, "this isn't about work, is it?" He hesitated, the silence that followed speaking louder than any admission. She could see it in his eyes, the longing, the regret, the hope that maybe, after everything, there was still a way back. But Katie wasn't the same woman who had once fallen for his charm without question. She had rebuilt herself piece by piece after every heartbreak, and though part of her still loved him, another part feared the gravity of that love. It pulled her in, but it also destroyed her. As Bill leaned forward, his voice lowered into something intimate. "I'm not asking you to forget the past. I'm asking you to build something new for us, for Will." His sincerity cut through her defenses, and for a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to imagine it. The three of them together again, rebuilding a family that had fallen apart too many times. But reality crept back in, reminding her of the cycles they could never quite escape. Still, the idea of working alongside him again stirred something she couldn't ignore, a spark she had thought long extinguished. Later that evening, as the city lights shimmered outside, Katie sat alone in her car, thinking of what Bill had said. Will had always loved his father, and lately, he had been talking about wanting to spend more time at Spencer Publications. Maybe Bill was right. Maybe this was an opportunity, not just for business, but for healing. But deep down, Katie feared that stepping back into Bill's orbit meant risking everything she had finally rebuilt for herself. Back at Forrester Creations, Dylan sat alone in one of the design rooms, her confessions still echoing in her ears. Finn had left the building without a word after hearing the truth, and Steffi had followed him, torn between comforting her husband and protecting the fragile woman who had just destroyed their peace. Dylan stared at the sketches on the wall, the colors blurring through her tears. She wondered if Luna's spirit lingered somewhere near, watching her, hating her, or perhaps forgiving her. She had come clean because she couldn't bear the silence any longer, but now that the words were out, she felt even emptier. When Finn returned hours later, his face was unreadable. He sat opposite Dylan, the distance between them heavy with unspoken emotion. "You took something from me," he said quietly. "But I believe you didn't mean to. That doesn't erase what happened, but it means something." His words were measured, fragile, as though he were speaking more to himself than to her. Dylan nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I'll carry it forever," she whispered. In another part of the city, Bill poured himself a glass of scotch and stared out at the night. He had spent years building an empire that touched every corner of Los Angeles, yet the only thing he couldn't control was the heart of the woman he loved. Katie's silence after their meeting told him everything. She was thinking, weighing, hesitating. He knew her well enough to understand that meant he still had a chance. But what he didn't realize was that Katie's decision would not only affect their relationship, it would ripple through the delicate balance of power between Spencer Publications and Forrester Creations. If she left, alliances would shift, and Electra Forrester, the ambitious young designer, would see it as an opportunity to rise. By midnight, the city had gone quiet, but inside every corner of Los Angeles, hearts were stirring, Dylan's with guilt, Finn's with grief, Katie's with confusion, and Bill's with longing. Each of them stood on the edge of choices that would reshape everything: love, forgiveness, redemption, and power colliding once more under the glittering surface of the bold and the beautiful. And as the new week began, the world of fashion and desire prepared for its next act, where every secret, every confession, and every temptation would demand a price none of them were truly ready to pay.